Thank you very much for joining us. In this second seminar, we're going to explore the connection between whiteness and coloniality. So we looked at coloniality in the first session. We've tried hard to include the most salient aspects of this, and it's possible that we may run over by a tiddly bit. We have rehearsed it, but if we do, and you have to go, please don't worry, the video recording will be available. Okay, Fatima.
So our starting point today is to start off with race, and that to acknowledge that race has no biological basis at all, and that race is a social construction that was used to justify the colonial project that promoted white Europeans as superior to all other racialized groups. And we're aware that sometimes race is equated with ethnicity. So to distinguish between them, I'm going to just read this here. Ethnicity refers to groups of people who identify with each other based on common ancestral, social, cultural, religious, or linguistic heritage. So both race and ethnicity are social constructs. However, as this slide asserts, racial distinctions can be so powerful that they are felt as real and can have life or death consequences. So Leeds 2015 points out that the fluid nature of these categories and how one's skin color shapes a person's worldview and lived experience, and how it shapes a person's worldview and lived experience. These are not inherent in an individual, but determined by society. So for example, the definition of white race has changed over time and has been determined really by people in power. So for example, in the United States, in the early 20th century, the Italians, the Greeks, the Jews, the Irish, and those from Eastern Europe were considered as non-white, and as a result, they were similarly oppressed to people of color. They gained privilege only when those in power expanded the definition of whiteness to include their nationality. So it was now nationality and color. Fran?
So thank you, Fatima. What we're emphasizing there is that whiteness is an ideology, and that's an ideology that was co-constituted with coloniality, and creates a hierarchy of privilege as shown on the left. And the image on the right shows how the racialized aspect of those hierarchies also intersect with a range of other dimensions of identity. And these create a complex set of hierarchies of advantage or privilege. And these privileges, as the person standing on top of the other person holding that person up is indicating, those privileges are only possible through the subjugation and exploitation of people whose identities don't conform to the white, Eurocentric, male, Christian, etc. norm. So if we think about this in relation to the UK, Britain is often imagined as a meritocracy. You know, if you work hard, you're going to get ahead. However, the idea of merit is understood to be a product of ability plus effort. And when perceived ability intersects with race and other dimensions of identity, differing levels of the privilege will then be experienced, and the idea of a meritocracy becomes problematic. And Fatima's got an example of this from a context that she's been working in.
So I'm going to, I taught in Saudi Arabia for 2 years, and when I was there, I made a couple of friends, and 2 other women, one that came from Uganda in Africa, and Northern Africa, Algeria. So the other one was from Algeria. And the the friend from Uganda was darker skinned and had a Ugandan passport. The one from Algeria could pass as white, but also had an Algerian passport. And I could have passed as white, but I had a Muslim name. And so that gave me a bit of a cachet. And also I had a Canadian passport. And depending on our nationality, the pay scales were determined. So if I came from, those that come from Britain had the highest salary, and then, the United States of America, and then it would go to Canada, Australia, and so forth and so on. And that's how they determined salary. And when you started to look at the chart that we made to see how the salary scale was worked out, it looked definitely it was about power, but also that you could see that the color of skin was coming through, that those that were darker were at, the countries that had people who had a darker skin were at the bottom of the scale for the salary, which was I hadn't really thought about that till much recently in terms of even how that was scaled for salary. It was a shocking revelation. But anyway, I just thought I'd share that with you. If we go to slide 4, Fran.
Yeah.
I'd like you to read, I'll read this for you, but Calvin Popal, who used to be in Birmingham, but I think she's moved now, says many white people take their identity for granted in ways that no non-white or Black person is able to. Non-white and Black people are constantly aware of their identity, particularly in relation to how they're positioned with whites. And one of the things that Fran and I have discussed several times is that I'm hypersensitive to the context around me in relation to race and racism and discrimination. And I think people of color tend to become hyper-reflexive. And there's several features of whiteness, including that it's relational. That is, it defines each, the other. In defining the other, it defines itself. So we're about identity. It is fluid, and these categories change over time. And I gave the example of what happened in the United States of America. It is also a state of unconsciousness. And it always puts white people or people that have embody whiteness in a place of cultural, structural advantage. And it is considered to be universal, as if whiteness is described and defined the world. Thank you, Fran.
That's okay. So on this slide, we're aware there's a lot of dense text, and we're not going to look at it all. The purpose of the slide is just to indicate that there are many ideas associated with the concept of whiteness, and so on the left there's a number of concepts and then issues associated with those concepts. And we're going to look particularly at white privilege and white fragility today within an overall structural context of white supremacy. But we're providing this slide along with a supporting link where there's some further reading in the team space. So all of you, if you're here, you will be invited into the team space if you haven't been already, and this information will be available for you there. So picking up on the idea of white fragility, this slide shows that white people have a range of emotional reactions when they're confronted with the ways in which they benefit from and are complicit in white privilege. Among these reactions are denial or resistance, guilt, claims to innocence, and so on, things that Robin DiAngelo refers to as white fragility. And on the left there, you can see there's a white person who's wearing her little halo that says, but I can't possibly be racist because, and then if we look at the bubbles, I didn't ask to be a white. Now I feel ashamed. I thought you wanted equality. My feelings are hurt, and so on and so forth. These are all, and I recognize these. I've said these things myself particularly in the early stages of coming to understand my whiteness. So reasons for these reactions will come from a range of different positions. Some white people may be too invested in the privileges accorded to them and not want to give them up. Others may believe that they have truly earned their own privileges as a result of their own efforts rather than them being structurally accorded to them. Others may not care that their privileges aren't earned. They're just going to say, thank you very much, that's a privilege, I'm going to take that. And yet others may not even care about those who are denied the privileges that they have. So there will be a whole host of positions in relation to the white fragility. And thinking about the way in which I became much more aware of this was as a result of Fatima and I starting to work together academically about 7 years ago. And we've been working in partnership pretty much since 2014. Yeah. And in the academic spaces where we've worked with, there are two particular spaces that I'm just going to give an example of here. One of those spaces is at the University of Regina, where I've been on a number of occasions co-teaching and co-researching with Fatima. And Fatima opened up the space for me to be able to work alongside her in a particular course that she used to run. And from 2007, Fatima would be presenting to her colleagues in the Faculty of Education. And then maybe in about 2015 or 2016 was the first time that I co-presented with Fatima. And I was a newcomer to that space, and yet the people in that space then directed their questions to me, as if I was the one who was holding the knowledge or somehow was legitimating what the research was just purely by being there. And Fatima also had a project in China. And on a couple of occasions, I was invited to work alongside her in China, again, doing some co-teaching and co-researching. And my white British, particularly, identity was definitely privileged in those spaces as well. And to be honest with you, Fatima had to point that out to me. I thought, oh, how nice, don't they think I'm wonderful? And then she had to point out what was going on. Yeah.
So
okay.
Could I just, I know
Yes,
we might run over time, but one of the things is that I had been working on culturally responsive pedagogies of relation from 2007. And when we did these brown bag seminars, I would have 2 or 3 people in the faculty that would show up to the seminars.
Yeah.
When Fran came, we had a full room every year. Yeah. So when when I did it was not validated, but when Fran started presenting with me, the room was full. It was always full, which is very interesting. In China, they would actually give Fran the center seat. And I would be really jealous. She'd be sitting on the front row in the center where she would get televised and photographs. And I couldn't understand why Fran couldn't see what they were doing, that I was being relegated to the margins. I'm the principal person. I'm the visiting professor. Fran is there on my account. And the research that we were doing, I was the principal investigator. And I thought, and yet they privileged Fran and completely relegated me to the margins. And so it was very, very difficult situation. But yeah, I just thought I'd add a little bit more context. So many of you may have heard of Peggy McIntosh. She's American, but she's also a sociologist, a professor of women's studies who taught at Wellesley College for many years. And Wellesley is the private college that Hillary Clinton attended, in case you didn't know. Most of the young women who can afford to attend Wellesley are white, upper class, and wealthy. And maybe you've seen the new Julia Roberts movie, Mona Lisa Smile. Like Julia Roberts' character, Peggy McIntosh got tired of teaching young women who couldn't see their own class privilege. And as a woman, she got tired of working with men who didn't understand and couldn't see their own gender privilege. So Peggy came to realize that as a white person, she had been taught not to see her own racial privilege. She began to think about the advantages that came to her simply by the virtue of being white. So Peggy McIntosh began to think about whiteness and about her own white privileges as if they were the contents of an invisible, weightless knapsack, a knapsack full of resources and useful provisions that she could draw on. And of course, this is metaphorically. In Peggy's invisible knapsack were special maps, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. When I read about Peggy's invisible knapsack of white privilege, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I started to think how could I bring that into teacher education, where 90% or 95% of the pre-service teachers that we teach are white students. So we're going to talk a little bit about the darker side of white privilege. And you can see from this slide, and it's quite dense, that there are systemic and structural racism in employment, in education, with regard to economic status, and also social control. And this becomes really problematic in terms of how disparities are viewed by the white mainstream population, because it, equated to meritocracy. Rather, you work hard and you'll succeed, but that's not true, because equal access to opportunities are not provided across the board. So you can see here that whiteness as a culture of white supremacy creates systems and structures that privilege whiteness and lead to inequality. And one of the examples that we want to give you is a local context, Ladywood Primary School in inner city Birmingham. Out of the 465 students that are there, only 10 children identify as white British. And 20 out of the same number identify as having a white British or white European identity. Of the 465 students, 307 speak English as a second language, although many are fluently bilingual or trilingual. And the school has a white non-teaching head. There are 16 teachers, of whom 8 are BAME and 8 are white. There are 8 teaching assistants, of whom 6 are BAME and 2 are white. And 3 English as an additional language teachers are also hired there, of whom two are BAME and 1 is white. So we can see that there is a representation of difference in the teachers and staff, but the head of the school is white, and one cannot but help but see the world with a white lens when somebody that's leading it has a white, is white. But I'd like to take you to places like Devon, where there are many rural schools in Devon, where the numbers of staff who are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds will be few and far between. And this is damaging both to the students and to the few BAME teachers that there might be predominantly in white schools. And here we're talking about even if white students don't see a representation of difference in their teaching staff, that shows, that BAME teachers don't exist in this structure, or are not, good enough to become teachers. And vice versa, in schools that are highly populated with students of color, if they don't see their own people represented in the schools, then they feel that they're not going to be able to achieve to that level, that they can't aspire to anything more than what is, what they can try to do on their own. I want to give an example of UBC. I taught at the University of British Columbia when I was doing my PhD. And I had to teach an introduction to language and literacy course to first-year students. And right from day one, there was resistance in the class. And most of the students, I would say about 85% of the students were of white heritage. And I guess I didn't have enough self-confidence at that time because I was still learning how to teach and so forth and so on at that level. And several students would call out, go back where you come from. We don't need Pakis we don't need Pakis as our teachers. And I would say, once I said back, I'm not a Paki. And even if I were a Paki, I think what you're saying is very offensive. And I left one class crying and went straight to my supervisor, who was also the head of the school. And I said to him, I don't want to teach anymore. I don't want to go back to that class. I don't want to be a professor. I just don't want it anymore. And when we had the second class a couple of days later, he came in and he actually told the students, so they had discussed, in the faculty meeting, that if any student said anything racist in the class, that they would immediately throw the student out of the program. And it was only after he said that students started to be a little bit more politically correct. But that really harmed. I really was going to leave academia at that point. But again, it's about power. It's about how students can also bully in classroom spaces, and how our assessments sometimes are those, assessments with people, scholars of color, how these can be influenced by racist views about them. Yeah, so I think I want to move away from talking about that. Fran, do you want to move on to the next slide?
Sure. Can I just add one point though?
Yeah.
Because the point is that if these are students who are training to become teachers, then what sort of attitudes are they taking into the classroom? And that's why when training, the majority of students who are becoming teachers are white, and they need to know this stuff. Okay, so from here, we're going to just probably speed through faster than we had intended because of time, untangling the ways in which whiteness is seen in action in literally the way in which life unfolds in the Western world. So this is thinking about ontological and epistemological ways of that whiteness is in action, ways of knowing, ways of being. And to start with, we're going to have a look at Darwin and the biological distinctions, how that led to ways that supported the white savior complex, and then looking at it from another lens through the cosmetic industry, and finishing up with institutional racism. Fatima?
Okay. So Europeans believed in hierarchies of intelligence and other hierarchies. In particular, Charles Darwin was convinced that evolution was progressive and that white races, especially the Europeans, were evolutionary more advanced than the black races, thus establishing race differences and a racial hierarchy. Darwin's views on gender were also utterly conventional. He stated that the result of sexual selection is for men to be more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than women, with a more inventive genius. I'm quoting here, that his brain is absolutely larger. Whereas for women, the formation of her skull is said to be intermediate between the child and the man. One of the consequences of Darwin's theory was the argument that the level of a person's intelligence was influenced by their biological racial makeup. And this led to the widespread use of IQ tests in the 20th century. Eugenicists latched onto IQ tests and the apparent gaps these tests illuminated between ethnic minorities and whites, or between low and high income groups. Some maintain that these test results provided further evidence that socioeconomic and racial groups were genetically different from each other, and that systemic inequalities were partly a byproduct of evolutionary processes. And I'm going to quickly tell you just one anecdote from my experience. I was married to a white British man, and so I had a mother-in-law living in Lincolnshire, Quen, about 85 years old. And in that area where they lived, there were a lot of doctors from South Africa and of South Indian or South Asian descent. And she always, every time she had an appointment to go to the clinic, she would, go on for 2 hours before the appointment about how they didn't know medicine, they didn't learn about medicine as well as the British doctors did, that they didn't know the culture, that they didn't know anything really, and that she was very reluctant to go. And this discourse happened every time she had a doctor's appointment, and there was no way of changing her way of thinking. And in the end, I thought to myself, she's 85, she's been brought up with very racist thought, and she forgave me because I was the lightest skin, but really, it's so entrenched and it's so pervasive that sometimes it's hard to shake. But I also want to say quickly that in my culture, people with whiter skin or lighter skin are more privileged and are thought to be able to marry well, as opposed to those that are darker. So without a critical untangling of these issues in education, these ideas continue to pass from one generation to the next. And recently, a few weeks ago, there was a recent item in the news in the United States where emeritus professor wrote that the average level of intelligence in sub-Saharan Africa is quite low, that African American women are overpaid relative to their cognitive ability, that brain size varies along racial lines and IQ is linked to brain size, and that people should face issues of eugenics and dysgenics more forthrightly than has recently been the case. And that was a direct quote. So ideas about race and intelligence from Darwinism can be connected to the white savior complex, which is performed through service learning, study abroad, volunteerism, charitable activities such as Red Nose Day. And I think we're going to move on to Fran giving an example about her project.
Okay. So when I was still a member of staff at the University of Exeter, I worked on a project, Global Partnerships for Mutual Learning, that was about taking groups of student teachers and practicing teachers to locations in the global south for various experiences in study visits. And just as an example, there was a group of student teachers from a university in the southeast of England who went to India for 3 weeks to a children's home where there was an on-site primary school. And this white savior complex became really, really evident, even in the way that they were preparing before they started their visit, before they left the shores of the UK. For example, one pre-service teacher, completely off her own accord, not being asked to do it, raised £500 through abseiling and was going to take a load of footballs and other things out there for those poor Indian children, in inverted commas. And another student, when they were asked to provide a written piece about why they wanted to go to India, she said, "I took part in the study visit because I wanted to experience poverty firsthand. If I had had the choice, I probably would have picked Africa because I think that's a continent where poverty is highlighted more like on Comic Relief." And hence the image of Lenny Henry here. But our point here is that when student teachers or teachers hold those views, then they hold those views about people who are racialized as black and brown, and they transfer those same views to people who are racialized as black and brown in this country as well. Fatima?
So not everybody, but some people in the global south aspire to whiteness because it represents power, wealth, and beauty. And historically, some countries such as Japan valued skin color for aesthetic reasons. But more recently, the discourse has changed. And for example, in China, you will find a lot of the young girls buying whitening products, trying to whiten their faces. And I'm also complicit in this. And I used to buy whitening products. And only stopped when I came back to Canada because I lived in Singapore and worked in China. And so, yes, it was only when I came back to Canada that I decided I wasn't going to play that game anymore. And so this is really problematic globally in the global South, really, wanting to have that white skin or to have that feeling that they have power, like the white people in the global north. Yeah.
And in this slide, institutional racism, just picking up on the thing that pretty much everybody is going to know about, the stop and search laws that exist in the UK with the police. And I've had direct experience of this through my nephew, Tyler, who is 16, who is of mixed race heritage, who went with his white friends to the fair in Barnstable. And in the 2 hours that they were there, he got stopped and searched by the police on 3 occasions, and none of his friends did. And not only that, when they looked in his bag, they saw a packet that was wrapped up in foil and immediately thought that he must be peddling drugs, and his mum had sent him with a sandwich. So that's what was inside the tin foil. So it's just, again, making the point, and obviously education itself has those same sort of levels of institutional racism. They might be expressed, but they do exist. So not going to spend too long on this slide. You've picked up on a number of ways, and we're just sort of reiterating here that in the UK, teachers are predominantly from white Euro-Western backgrounds. In their preparation to become teachers, they are educated by predominantly white Western European teacher educators. So their experience of education is culturally located within whiteness and coloniality. And we're saying that the lack of awareness of that whiteness and the way in which it's structurally embedded into how they are prepared to become teachers then gets carried through into their practices and the ways in which they are unprepared to work with and alongside the differences that they will experience in those classrooms. So those white teacher ways of being that they've been socialized into are things that we think decolonizing educational relationships is about. Fatima, do you want to add anything to that?
I think we should talk about care. So if you could quickly go to nodding, because that's really important.
Yeah, so I'm going to read this bit because it's important to get the wording right. One of the ways in which white middle-class liberal values are performed in classrooms is the way in which many teachers say they care for their students. And I don't know of a teacher who doesn't go into the profession because they care about young people. And there's some seminal work done by Nell Noddings on care, who says that the caring teacher strives first to establish and maintain caring relations, and that these relations exhibit an integrity that provides the foundation for everything teachers and students do together. And that all sounds great, but what Nell Noddings doesn't do is pay attention to the racialized and other power relations, or to acknowledge that there may be plural understandings of what it means to care. And the work of Cheryl Matthias and Zembailas argue that care, as expressed by white pre-service teachers in the United States, which is where they did their work, can disguise feelings of disgust for the other. And this form of care is argued to be a colonial objectification of the other as someone to be pitied for not possessing those aspects of being human that characterize the hegemonic identity that is white, middle class, male, heterosexual, and so on. Okay, so in this final, penultimate slide, what Fatima and I did was we thought about how could we represent the ways in which we have worked together in an intercultural space, which has made it possible for me to grow from that initial starting point of where I was unaware of my whiteness. And in the diagram on the right-hand side is my starting point, which was a space of comfort as an academic, as somebody who'd worked for a number of years on a global partnerships project, very sensitive, or so I thought, to issues of difference. And yet there was a lack of criticality around that. I definitely was unaware of the ways in which I embodied whiteness in those interactions. I was not aware, I hadn't even come across the terms positionalities and subjectivities. All of this was new to me. So my starting point was security. I know who I am, I know what I think, I know who I am as an academic, etc., etc. And then Fatima and I, when we were working together, she started to point out all of the ways in which I was performing my whiteness in an unintended or an unconscious ways, unconscious ways. And as those aspects of me were challenged, they really made me think, oh my gosh, I actually don't know who I am. This is an aspect of myself that was hidden from me. And I started to get confused. I was uncertain. I definitely displayed many of those white fragility things that we referred to earlier. Sometimes I was resistant. Sometimes I would run into the loo and have a cry and come back out again. Because I thought, but I'm a nice person, you know, just like that little halo. I'm a nice person. How could I possibly be these things as well? But the important thing was to stick with that and not to run away from it, and to use that to begin to understand that I've got to learn how to unlearn this stuff. I've got to listen to what Fatima is saying to me with love. I mean, with humility and trust. And I needed to be open to listening to that stuff, go away and think about it, and develop an awareness of this aspect of myself that had been so hidden from me before. So then it was possible to move into a growth space. And in this growth space came a gradual critical self-awareness. That growth space was also, I have to acknowledge, partly because I had the personal investment from my family with the mixed race nephews. I had a personal investment through the work that Fatima and I were doing in partnership that we both valued, wanted to learn from each other. And from that, as my identity expanded, I was able to gradually decenter from that white core. The white core doesn't disappear, but what it does is get smaller in relation to the growth space that I was able to move into. So I'm always going to be white. I still make mistakes on a literally daily basis. Fatima still is kind enough to point out those mistakes, and we talk about them, and it's become central to the work that we do together as well. And in fact, I couldn't have done it without Fatima. And we made a little list of some of the core values that we felt were necessary between us in order to enable this growth to happen. And the first one is humility, and then openness, authenticity, honesty, stickability, responsibility, and trust. Fatima, do you want to add to?
Yeah, honesty is really paramount. I mean, you have to be honest with yourself, and to be able to acknowledge that these are some of the privileges that you bring to the table. But more importantly, as Fran was speaking there, that this was not a linear progression, and it will never be linear, because she moves from comfort to growth to challenging, that she goes back, I don't want to deal with this. This is what I know, and this is where I want to stay. And then she goes back to that comfort space because I just don't want to do it anymore. I'm tired. I don't want to worry about the whole world and, you know, people of color. And then after a couple of days, she'll come back and say, okay, I get it. And then she'll move along. So that movement between comfort and confused and expanding is always, it's interrelated. It moves from different spaces. She regresses, she goes back. And I'm learning from her as well. But something that we want you to think about as we leave this, finish this lecture today, is that you need to do this work yourself before you can even start thinking about how you would teach to the other. And it's not just students of color. It's, you know, the intersectionalities of gender, class, and so forth and so on. So, but this really expect to go through these different ways of being, doing, and viewing the world as you move towards a more decolonial lens. And I think, yeah, we can move on to. So in this slide, we're trying to figure, this is what we've come up with in terms of disentangling whiteness in education. And many of you said a lot of these things in the chat group. You need to look at yourself in terms of your own identity, your own subjectivities and positionalities. And you have to look at the geopolitical, historical influences that have made who you are, and how these have positioned you in relation to the other. You then also need to look at the curriculum. And so decolonizing education is not about pluralizing education only, or pluralizing content. We do need to pluralize content, but it's actually the relationship to the content, to the space, to the people that, that you're working with. And in terms of pedagogy, you have to ask yourself questions about equity and develop equitable educational relations. How do I position myself and others whilst I teach? How do I be in, how can I be inviting and hospitable to students who are not from the mainstream? And how can I work with them with who they are rather than who I would like them to be? And I think these are the first steps that you need to start thinking about before you even start thinking about decolonizing the curriculum, which has become a buzzword. You know, we're hearing all over decolonizing science, decolonizing geography, and but you can't decolonize a curriculum if you don't understand your own identity and your relationship to the geopolitical context that you're in, and how that is in, and the historical, and how that has influenced your ways of being and doing in the classroom, and your ways of having been taught in teacher education of how to be a good, what counts as a good teacher. So I think those are the things that we would like you to consider as we leave you today.